Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. Welcome, Katherine, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Hey, excited to be here. Let's talk about spiritual abuse.
Yeah, that's true. I've just got this email from a good friend of mine, David Morris. He's been on the show before. He is the publisher at Lake Drive Books. And I've had a couple of different authors, as well as having David on the show. And you've written a book that literally, as we're doing this recording, has just come out a couple of days ago. Now, I love the subtitle because you could read the title, say, okay, it's 1,000 tiny paper cuts. Now, if you just stop there, you wouldn't know what it's about. It could be anything, but the subtitle kind of gives the game away, doesn't it? It says, The Subtle, Insidious Nature of Spiritual Abuse and Life on the Other Side. So this is all about leaving religion, leaving high control groups, spiritual abuse. This is exactly, as we said before we hit record, this is the demographic largely of my audience.
Yes.
So what led you to write the book? I mean, I read your bio, you came out of that sort of background yourself. Was that your own personal story as well?
Yes. So the two pieces, I use my story to teach about spiritual abuse and also just experience with working with clients, working with folks through a nonprofit that I founded, Tears of Eden, which is for survivors of spiritual abuse. And I use to teach about spiritual abuse, the experience of spiritual abuse, primarily use my story. First, grew up in a cult called the Christian patriarchy movement. One of the main markers of that is that women had to stay under their father's authority and a lot of times physically in their father's home until they got married. I wasn't allowed to go to college. I wasn't supposed to plan to have a career. I got out of that, fell right into evangelicalism that I thought for about a decade was so much better, but then saw so many of the same high control tactic, the cult that I was in evangelicalism, just much more subtle, and they're a lot nicer about it. And so it was harder to pick up on, but eventually I was like, this is literally the same thing that I left. So I made a relation between those two things.
Yeah. Were you a stay-at-home daughter? Were you part of that movement?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've talked to some people who were part of that as well. So yeah, that's a thing, isn't it? Some of the names that I've done, because I've done a lot of research on this biblical patriarchy, Christian patriarchy, would names like Doug Wilson, R.J. Rushdoony, would those names resonate with you at all from your background, your experience? How would they have sort of influenced you? I guess it was more your family, isn't it? The context in which you were raised.
And all of those people, Doug Wilson, Doug Phillips, Bill Gothard, they were in our homes, in our communities, either physically or through their teachings. And yeah, very, very influential in our way of life.
Yeah, it's very damaging, isn't it? Because I was raised in the Bill Gothard cult. So we have something in common there. My parents were part of the leadership because I grew up in Seattle. I live in the UK now, but I grew up in Seattle, Washington. And I remember going to the seminars when I turned 13. It was a big thing. My folks were part of the host and hostess committee. They were the presidents.
Like the basic life principles ones.
Yeah. Originally, it was called Institute and Basic Youth Conflicts when I was a kid. And then it changed, obviously, to IBLP. But a lot of people who've seen shiny, happy people, season 1 and 2, they can resonate. They're like, oh, right. So that's who Bill Gothard was.
Yeah. And it's very influential within evangelicalism, even if people don't actually know that it came from Gothard. And they would say Bill Gothard's extreme, but a lot of those same mindsets are still very present in evangelicalism. And I was able to see them because I was in that cult, and then I went into like just mainstream evangelicalism, and I was like, wait a second, this isn't any different. This is the same thing. It's just a little bit more polished and a little less overt.
Yeah, because I think I've done episodes on, maybe there is a difference between quote unquote biblical patriarchy and Christian patriarchy. One's maybe a little bit more extreme. I found some differences, but essentially it's this model, isn't it, that women are to be submissive to their fathers / their husbands when they get married, so there's this.
And in the context of church, it's a a lot of them are very patriarchal churches. Some of them are very overt about that. Like, it's fine if you're a female president, but you can't be a female pastor and stuff like that. And then even and this is like, I mentioned this in my book as well. I left a pretty chronically abusive church, and then I didn't leave ministry immediately, and I was still looking for church jobs. And I was like, I'm done with that denomination that follows complementarianism and says only men can be pastors. So I started looking for jobs outside of that denomination, more egalitarian churches, and I found the same thing.
Oh no.
Like this,
I was gonna say,
so,
I hate you found so.
and then they're like patting themselves on the back because they have just,
Yeah.
but the same bullshit is happening in those spaces too. And that was when I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. I'm just, you cannot
See it.
not gonna even. Yeah.
Yeah, and could it be quite triggering as well? It's just coming out of your background, your experiences growing up in that stay-at-home daughter movement. Did you find that it was triggering in that sense when you saw, wait a minute, these are the same exact things that I thought I was getting away from? Did you struggle with that when you were, sort of in those experiences?
I don't know. I think I lived in denial and believed that it was different. Yeah, because they would say things like, "Oh my gosh, you weren't allowed to go to college? That's terrible." And so they were acknowledging what I was in wasn't good. And at the same time, I'm bumping into these barriers. And it was like, "Oh, that's fine. I don't need the title pastor just as long as I can do the work that I at the time felt called to do and felt passionate about." And then realized, like, actually, no, pastor is a title that means that people actually respect you and listen to you, and also impacts how much you get paid and creates a barrier between what women can do in these spaces and what men can do in these spaces. And even though they told me, don't worry, you're equal, you're respected, that wasn't true. And so I believed what they were saying to me, and I had to have very painful experiences in order to realize actually that's not true. What they're saying is not true.
So is that the element of spiritual abuse? Because we haven't defined that yet. As you define
Yeah, the levelty of it.
how do you define that? Because I mean, I remember talking a few years ago. There's a good friend of mine. Her name's Josie McSkimming. She's from Australia, from Sydney, and she's a therapist now. And she talked about it. She said one of the things when I said, "How did you deconstruct? How did you end up getting out of evangelicalism and walking away?" She said it always bothered me as a woman, years and years as a Christian, that, like you just articulated, I'm somehow not as good as the men who are, and yet she's clearly intelligent. She got a PhD. She's a therapist. She did that in her private practice. And she's saying, how I can't square this with my lived experience. And it finally just the cognitive dissonance just became too much. And she realized I've been suppressing my authentic self for way, way, way too long. Is that spiritual abuse as you would define it?
The art of using God and the Bible to protect male power and authority is spiritual abuse. Yes,
Right.
that is very much so. Is every situation of patriarchy abusive? I don't know. But that practice of saying men are in this position because God said so, that is spiritual abuse. Yes.
And it certainly creates an environment rife for other types of abuse. It's sexual abuse as well. I mean, that narrative
100%.
is
And
just
it attracts them.
exactly.
It attracts these men with these proclivities because it's like, I can get away with it here. And that's being missed in the conversation. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is I was like, that part of it is being missed, this connection between the theology and the belief system and the abuse. That's not really talked about in the conversation because nobody wants to poke at the bear and say, maybe there's something wrong with evangelicalism. Maybe there's something wrong with the water that we're swimming in, and making that connection between the theology and the abuse is a part of the conversation that I saw missing.
Yeah, that's the thing. And it creates an environment rife for abuse. Like you said, on one hand, it attracts people who know they can get, the chances are much higher that they'll get away with it if they do, quote unquote, get caught or get reported.
Absolutely.
And the other aspect, I think, is where the woman is always blamed. You led him astray by dressing provocative, and that goes straight back to Bill Gothard. He wasn't the only one teaching this, was he? But setting an eye trap for the man, and if a man falls into sexual sin 9 times out of 10 or more than that, it's the woman's fault for leading him astray. I mean, that's the atmosphere, isn't it? That is right for you.
Yeah, it's the other side of rape culture, where when a woman gets raped, what was she wearing? Like that. It's the exact same mode. It is a power and control approach, not necessarily a sexual gratification approach. And I think when you look at it through that lens, it's easier to make the connection to abuse.
Would you expand on that? Because you talk about this idea of using or misusing the Bible to justify male patriarchy. That certainly is rife for abuse. Are there other elements of spiritual abuse? Because I could think of a few examples. I'm interested to hear could you expand on that as well? Are there other things besides the patriarchy, or are you just taking aim primarily at the whole, burn down the patriarchy thing? Is that what your aim is?
What I'm not sure I understand the question. Is it about other examples of spiritual abuse?
Yeah,
Fall into that same category?
outside of the patriarchy model, that's certainly a big one. I can think of, any pastor, any preacher can use or misuse the Bible to exert control over his or her church and cause all kinds of untold damage, not necessarily related to patriarchy. Are there any other examples you could think of that, besides the patriarchy thing?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about purity culture there for a minute, and the just extreme. It's less about sex, and it's less about you can only have sex when you're married. That is like the very truncated, narrow version of purity culture. But behind that is layers and layers and layers of control of bodies, very specifically women's bodies, tons of shame, causing you not just to suppress your sexual desires, but we're holistic human beings, right? So we like to think we can compartmentalize sex from the rest of our humanity, but it's very connected to our humanity. So if we're suppressing our sexual desires, we're suppressing other desires too. So it's a very concerted effort to control an entire population, and it works. You go after people's bodies. And that is a very common control tactic, right? Of focusing on people's physical appearance, extreme labor or extreme activities to keep people's bodies under control, telling people what they can wear, what they can't wear. All of those same tactics wrapped up in this. Oh, we're trying to protect you and we're trying to give you a good marriage, and that's how it's packaged. So that's another one. Another one that's kind of connected to that is the principle of God doesn't want you to be happy; He wants you to be holy. And so, focusing so much on being right and doing the right things, and completely ignoring your intuition, what you care about, what you want. Because if we're talking to our intuition and we're connected to our bodies, then that's when we start to see, hey, I don't actually like this. I don't actually want to do this. We might have preferences, we might have opinions. And so it's better to just get you to a place where you just mistrust your desires and your thought altogether. Then we're just kind of self-policing, and they don't really have to do a whole lot, right? Because we're controlling ourselves in the name of being good Christians. So there's a lot more, but those are some
Particular ones.
common ones.
And then, like you said, it reminds me of Hassan's bite model. They were talking about behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. We have to become our own police. We could commit a thought crime against God, and we have to confess that later. And so there's a psychology of high control groups in that, which is universal across the board. Just not just evangelicalism, but certainly into any kind of high control cult or group, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What about the role of power imbalances? You talk about that in the book. I mean, obviously, patriarchy lends itself to a massive power imbalance. How does that relate to this issue of spiritual abuse? I mean, obviously, if you put a pastor up on a pedestal, you got celebrity pastors, guys like Mark Driscoll and so many others. How does that relate? How does that tie into the issue of spiritual abuse?
All abuse has power and control at its core, and abuse can be defined as someone using their power to exploit, control, coerce, manipulate, and then you just add the word spiritual in there. Someone who's using their spiritual power to coerce, control, manipulate, exploit someone using God in the Bible. And so all abuse has power and control at the center of it. The tricky part about a spiritual abusive context or a religious context is you're going to have people in that context who are very deliberately targeting people and actually manipulate, people like Bill Gothard, we have figured out how to use this system to work for us. And so they are deliberately manipulating the system and exploiting people using the Bible and God to do it. You're going to have just as many people, probably more people, who are doing the exact same thing. And they're good, decent people believing that they're doing what God wants them to do. And that's where it gets really murky and really tricky, and where I feel like it kind of sets spiritual abuse apart from other types of abuse because of that layer of it and that confusion of it associated with a belief system that may be a little bit more easy to pinpoint outside of a religious context when it's sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse, and there's not that spiritual element and that spiritual community wrapped up in it. So yeah, there's power and control is at the heart of all abuse, very much so in spiritual abuse.
Yeah, it's never good to be on the receiving end of basically like being bullied. Because I was thinking when you were describing that a few months ago, I kind of got hauled on the carpet at work, and it wasn't something I had done. I needed some support, but it got turned around on me. So my sort of second in command boss basically shut me down and wouldn't let me, talk and defend myself and give my side of the story. And I walked away from that conversation feeling like, yeah, I've been bullied. That's a power
Yeah.
imbalance. He just shut you down and said, stop talking. I'm going to basically talk over you and I'm not going to let you. And I walked away. I thought, God, that's a horrible thing. Now, there's nothing spiritual about that. That's just a secular work context.
Yeah.
But then when you add, like you say, then the spiritual, because I was thinking, John MacArthur passed away just a few months ago as we're doing this recording now. And I did a lot of stuff on him. Obviously, the Roy's Report has done did a lot of reporting when he was still alive. There was that famous story of the woman who came to the church to report her abusive husband. And yet John MacArthur used literally his bully pulpit to name and shame this woman and say she's not being submissive and all this. So you got patriarchy, you got spiritual abuse, you got, power imbalance, all that there in that kind of example.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think power can be real power or it can be perceived power. And I think in spiritual abuse, you're going to have a lot of perceived power of people being like, God said this. And they may not actually be in a position of spiritual authority. They might not be a parent or a pastor or a campus leader, but because they are tapping into a spiritual authority and they're saying, God said you should do this because God wants you to do this. They may be your peer because they've called on a higher power, they've called on a supreme being or whatever. They are putting themselves in a position of power. And I think that's something that sometimes gets missed in the conversation too, even if it's not someone who is your boss or your spiritual authority. If they're claiming God as an authority, they've made themselves that. And that makes it really murky and confusing as well.
Yeah, you're right. Adding that layer of spirituality, it's something you talk about in the book. You talk about spiritual gaslighting. And I'd never heard that term. I mean, I'm familiar with gaslighting. I've been gaslit before. I know what it feels like to begin be on the receiving end of being gaslit. What is the difference between, is that, spiritual gaslighting and just regular gaslighting? If you
Yeah.
add spiritual, or how does that actually work?
I'm talking about spiritual bypassing, which can also be like a form of gaslighting as well. Trust God in all circumstances and rejoice always. And, someone dies, they're in a better place. Why are you sad? Their load is why I haven't, that just kind of you use spirituality to just completely ignore people. And then gaslighting of saying things like, well, that's not really the way it was, or like, why did that bother you? Or, oh, that's not how I remember it, or anything to like make the person look like they're just making up the story or that they're unstable or they're unhinged. And of course, the person who's traumatized in the situation is probably not super calm and collected, right? Like, probably very dysregulated and disrupted, and so then the abuser can just show up and be like, "I'm so fine. I'm fine. I don't understand what's going on here." And that usually make the victim look like they're crazy in that context.
And then when you add, I mean, like going back to your comment about adding the spiritual element, if you've got the Bible to back you up, if you're the pastor, there's the power imbalance right away. You're a man of God. You're up on that pedestal. You've got a seminary degree. You've got maybe even a PhD from Bible college. You said where you can read Greek, you can read Hebrew, so you can properly unpack the Word of God. And that's another layer of ammunition, isn't it, to use in that spiritual gaslighting context. The Bible's backing me up. So not only am I the pastor, I'm the authority figure. This is what the Bible says, and you're not submitting or whatever. You're a Jezebel if you're a woman, that kind of thing. That's another sort of insidious aspect of the whole thing.
Yeah, and pastors using things like apologies or forgiveness or repentance as a way to gaslight people. And I've seen, pastors who were treating people horribly get in the pulpit and then just weep and quote unquote repent. But then they never actually named anything specific. They just said things like, I'm a dirty, rotten sinner, but for the grace of God go I. And they would say all these like highfalutin things to like make themselves look humble, and the congregation would walk away being like, oh my goodness, they're such a humble person. We're so lucky that that pastor is here. and only to find out, like, it's a total smokescreen, and they know exactly what to say. They're master manipulators, and they know how to use the Bible to work for them. And one of the things I talk about in my book is the damaging version of forgiveness that we're fed, which is like always leave room for the offender to repent, always be willing to extend forgiveness. Not forgiving is like, heard someone say this, not forgiving is just like swallowing your own pee. What the heck? What does that mean? Like, and like just a very damaging, that is like putting the onus for the quote unquote restoration of the relationship on the person who has been injured, as if the person who has been injured is just doesn't matter, right? Like the person who matters is the perpetrator, because we're always worried about the perpetrator's restoration. And you're seen as a psycho bitch if you're like, I'm not actually ready to forgive right now, and I don't know if I ever will be. And that's one of the things in my book that I wanted to unpack a little bit of, just like, this is, if forgiveness is actually for the victim, if that's what we say and is actually for them, then they get to decide when, where, how that looks on their own time. And if they never do it, and I even think for a situation of abuse, just take forgiveness off the table. Just don't even put that pressure on yourself. Like, just worry about getting better, getting healing, validation, compassion. If forgiveness pops up sometime down the road and that's something you want to explore, go for it. But just don't even put pressure on yourself to forgive. That's usually the first thing that happens in spiritual communities is, well, have you forgiven them? Oh, you're telling the story. You sound bitter. Like, just, and it works, right? It's part of that control of keeping the victims quiet, and keeping them quiet, using God in the Bible to do it.
I mean, how many examples have we seen of that pastor who sexually abused someone in the congregation is quickly restored, quote unquote, to ministry? I mean, Andy Savage, that was another one a few years ago.
We love a redemption story.
Yeah, getting a standing ovation. Yeah, in front of the congregation. He confessed to a few things he did, a few years ago. He made some inappropriate decisions and was really quickly whitewashed and gaslit, but he's fine now. We restored him back into ministry. Or Josh Duggar, he went to a Bill Gothard camp sort of thing, and it fixed his proclivity towards child porn and, whatever else, and pedophilia. He's fine now. Well, obviously he wasn't fine. He ended up reoffending. And, he's in prison now. So it's like, why are we shocked when this narrative keeps, repeating and repeating?
Yeah. And it's a system that protects abusers and potentially was created by abusers to begin with. It's like, oh, this works. Let's use this to like manipulate an entire demographic of people.
Yeah. When we come back from the break in the second half of this conversation with Katherine Spearing, we're going to get even more into her backstory, as well as concluding the episode with looking at how to recover if you have been the victim of spiritual abuse in any way, shape, or form. So this is going to be a very helpful conversation. So stay tuned for part 2 coming up here in just a few minutes. I just wanted to mention that we've got just one more episode, and that'll be the last one I do for 2025 before taking a break for the Christmas holidays. And that's going to be a conversation I had a while ago with Brant Burleson out of Houston, Texas. I think I mentioned this before. This guy has an absolutely amazing story. He used to work at the Israeli consulate out of Houston, and he talks about how essentially they were running a psyops on Christian fundamentalist churches in the Southwest region, basically weaponizing Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism to support blindly the state of Israel. And especially now, of course, what's going on in Gaza, this becomes an even more poignant story. So we're going to have that episode with Brant to round out the end of the year. And then coming back in January, I've got a couple episodes I've already done in the can. I'm going to do a crossover episode starting in January with Nick P. from the Autistic Pod. This is a fascinating conversation with someone who's very much on the spectrum. And I learned a lot from Nick, and I think you'll learn a lot from that as well as I interacted with him and learn his 9 rules for life, which are really quite helpful. We're going to do a crossover episode, as I said, so part 1 will be on one show, part 2 will be on the other, so you'll have to head over to the Autistic Pod to catch his interview of me in part 2. So again, that's going to come up in early January. And then just the other day, as I'm doing this recording now, I had a really good conversation with Brian and Troy. These are the former hosts from Australia of the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, which is now officially off the air. I think this might be one of the very final interviews that these guys are going to do. And as always, we had a really fantastic conversation. I love talking to those guys. They're brothers from another mother, even though I've never met them in person. Someday, if I go down to Australia or if they come to the UK, maybe we'll be able to meet up in person. We're definitely kindred spirits. And like I say, we had a really good conversation. So those 2 episodes are coming up in January. And then I've also got a request, and this is something I was chasing up all autumn, all fall, an interview with Katherine Stewart. She's got a new book out called Money, Lies, and God. And for some reason or another, we were just unable to put it together. So I'm still chasing up having that interview with Katherine Stewart. So hopefully we'll have that coming up again in January next year, or maybe February. We will see. I'm going to contact her and see if I can book in an interview about her new book. And then speaking of books, as always, my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. It is available exclusively on Amazon. You can get it as a paperback, as a Kindle, or you can get my version of it, the Audible version, which I read. I narrated it, which I think was a really good thing to do. And definitely based on the feedback and the reviews I've got, people seem to enjoy hearing my voice reading and telling my own story. So you can catch that on Amazon. And do me a favor, if you do pick up a copy of the book, leave me a review on Amazon, which helps greatly with the rankings. And I'll just say too, coming up here in December, one last thing, we have Kelsey McGinnis and Marissa Burt. I had them as guests on the show a while back, talking about their new book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. And we're going to have our final Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call with Marissa and Kelsey on the 7th of December. And that is going to be held at 8 p.m. UK time. And that translates to noon on the West Coast in North America and 3 p.m. on the East Coast in North America. If you can catch that, the way to get access to that call is to become a Patreon supporter of the show. And in fact, speaking of Patreon supporters, I want to give a big thank you to Robert DeGraff, who's a new $1 a month Patreon supporter, as well as Marianne Franklin, who just renewed her $10 a month Patreon support of the show. If you want to do that and become a part of the Dismantling Doctrine podcast Patreon community, the links to that are in the show notes, and you can get access to that great call with Marissa and Kelsey coming up here in December. And then we're going to start up again in January with a new guest. We're going to figure out who that is. All right, let's get on back into this conversation with Katherine Spearing, talking about her book, 1,000 Tiny Paper Cuts, as we continue to look at this issue of the insidious nature of spiritual abuse. So the people you work with, you do therapy? Is that what you do? You're helping people?
I'm a drummer recovery practitioner, yeah. So I see individual clients, and then through Tears of Eden, we have some private support groups for survivors as well.
So what is there like a common narrative that you hear? I mean, obviously you've written about it in your book that you find, because I've talked to other therapists and they say, I mean, I end up kind of hearing the same basic narrative, the same story from person after person after person. Is there a commonality? Do you hear the same types of things from your clients?
Yeah, I think some common things are people who have moved on from Christianity. They've just fully decided like that's not for me anymore, or they're trying to navigate having some kind of personal spirituality, but they have decided just for now, doing institutional church isn't working for me. And within that, I feel like it's very common for folks to feel a lot of shame on top of this choice that is a very empowered choice, in my opinion, to just say, this actually isn't working for me and I'm going to pursue health and healing elsewhere. Or institutional church isn't working for me and I'm going to explore what does a personal spirituality, personal relationship look like. Because there's such a strong, you should do this and this is what Christianity looks like. There's a lot of shame in folks wanting to try something else and wanting to move on to something else. So I think it's important to bring awareness to that. That's very normal to feel that. And also that shame is something that we have been inherited and conditioned by these communities to feel as part of the control and to explore something. I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I made the choice to I'm just taking a break from church. I'm taking a break from God. I'm just gonna give myself some time to just recover. I cannot tell you how many times people only wanted to know when I was going back to church.
Yeah.
Like they gave come about zero shits about what happened to me or what made me make that choice to begin with. They just want to know when I'm going back to church. And eventually, when I didn't go back, they started assigning who I was and deciding for me that I wasn't a Christian, even though I had never said that ever. Just deciding on my behalf where I was spiritually based on the fact that I wasn't going to institutional church. That is control. Like, that is indoctrination. That is brainwashing. That you are determining where someone is in their spiritual journey based on their church attendance. That is indoctrination. Right.
Yeah. That's for cult psychology.
Mhm.
Well, going back to your own story, I don't know if we ever actually finished it. I mean, you talked about, okay, so you went back to this evangelical sort of mainstream out of this patriarchy cult. Take us through the process of the deconstruction, because obviously that's another thing you talk about in the book, faith
Yeah.
deconstruction. What is it? How did it actually work for you? What was because the thing about the 1,000 tiny paper cuts, it wasn't just one cut, it was a death of
Right.
1,000 cuts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it wasn't like you
Mhm.
just woke up one morning and said, you know what? I'm done. I'm out. Maybe, yeah, but
And that's typically the way it is for folks, like the, slow process. And I would say leaving the Christian patriarchy movement, in that space, I actually found comfort in the Bible. And I found comfort with a personal relation and finding a personal relationship with God within that space. And so like that was comforting to me. And so I made an intentional choice to go into ministry because I was like, what I was learning here was not the real Bible, and that was not the real Christianity. And I want to learn the real Christianity and real Bible so that I can teach, this narrative and this story and this love and this all of these things that I was seeing. And the questions that I had, and I was like, I need to go to seminary so I can like get some of these questions answered. Went to seminary, didn't get any of the questions answered, actually left with questions. Even then, I was just like, I want to teach the real Christianity. And very subtly, I think, again, I was kind of living in denial a little bit because this is like my vocation, right? Like I chose this as a career of doing ministry, of teaching the Bible, of talking about God. And so I was feeling this sense of like, I'm teaching something different. I'm seeing something different. I'm teaching something different than what is being taught elsewhere or around me or above me. And one of the things was there's really not a lot in the Bible about sex, right? Like there's not a lot of prescription about sex and how you're supposed to actually. There's some culture stuff happening, and there's like cultural rules within the context of some of the historical books, but I was like, I'm not actually seeing any mandate about what you're supposed to do. And then we've got like David, who's got multiple wives, and we've got Saul, who's got multiple wives. We've got Abraham, who's got multiple wives. We're not really, there's nothing in here that is like overtly teaching about what your sexual ethic is supposed to actually be. And I've studied the Bible, right? Like I read it multiple times. I've been to seminary. I'm like, where is it? I would love to see it. Show me where it is.
someone.
And then it's just this really strong narrative of you can only have sex in the context of marriage and only between one man and one woman. And that just didn't seem consistent with what I was seeing. So then I'm in these spaces and I was working with youth, and there was like this kind of unspoken rule that if you are sleeping with somebody outside of marriage, that you couldn't be a youth leader. And I don't there were some churches where that was like actually in writing. And then there were some places where it was just kind of like an unspoken rule. This is what we're teaching the kids, so you better not do it either. And yet all of the youth leaders were
Sleeping around.
they were like having sex with their boyfriend, and they were keeping it quiet because they hear the rules of the church.
Job.
And so technically as the youth director, I'm supposed to, I guess, fire them. But I'm like, but I just don't see how sex has anything to do with how they show up in a space. Like who they're sleeping with doesn't I don't that doesn't impact whether or not they're a good person to be around these kids. And so like some stuff like that was just, I'm just gonna keep quiet about it. I'm not gonna say anything. I'm not gonna make a big deal about it. Um Yeah, and so that was kind of like there was a deconstruction process unofficial. That was kind of like where it started. And then having like an overt abuse situation. And there's the theology part that I'm working through. Then there's an overtly abusive situation that prompted me to leave ministry altogether simply because of trauma and abuse. And that was probably where I started was researching trauma and abuse and eventually realized, oh, the theology is the thing that's causing it. This theology is the soil in which this abuse is growing. So it's kind of like a little like reverse deconstruction a little bit, just a little bit. A little backwards. It was the study of abuse and trauma that led me to realize there's something wrong with this theology.
Yeah, it's a feature, not a bug. Basically, what you're saying, it's not just a one-off thing, is it? It's that, like I said, I love that analogy. It's the soil in which it grows.
It's a system, yeah.
It's a culture. It's a system. Like we said before, it's a system rife for abuses. So of course it's gonna happen.
And it
But
normalized
sure,
it. It normalizes abuse.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, and then people get away with it, and then they could be quickly restored back, and then keeping it. It's the classic Catholic Church narrative, isn't it? The priest who abuses children. It starts to be reported. It starts to become a problem. Comes along and moves him to another parish somewhere else where he continues to abuse, and it just repeats and repeats and repeats. And then when they found out, they deny, deny, deny. They blame, and it's just that's essentially a similar type story. You would never accuse Father so and so of abusing a child. How dare you? He's a revered priest. He's a revered pastor. So there's that again. We're bumping up against that power imbalance thing, aren't we?
Exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned too in the book. You say that spiritual abuse occurs in Christian nationalism. This is a thing that I've done a lot of research on: dominion theology, Christian nationalism. How does it occur there? Because now we're sort of shifting into the realm of politics and all that. How do you see it playing out in Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I don't actually address a lot of Christian nationalism directly in the book. I do mention that I went to a camp that trained teenagers how to take over the government for God. And those are the ones that are in power right now. Like I'm 40. Those were my peers going to these camps being trained to take over the government for God. And when I see stuff on social media about, oh my gosh, they're destroying our democracy. Evangelicals don't care about democracy. So like using that as an argument of like, you're destroying our democracy. They want it to be a Christian state, a Christian nation.
Yeah.
And many of my peers believe that's good and that's right. And they're doing a good thing by trying to take over the government for God. And you're not going to get through to somebody by saying democracy is at stake. Like they're just, that's not where they're coming from. And the only hope I can really give people is I got out. And then I think stories helped me get out, interacting with people who are different than me, helped me get out, helped me realize that there's something wasn't right, or gave me a desire to just have a very human approach to people and connect with people based on our shared collective mutual humanity as opposed to what we believe. And I think that there is hope. And I feel like what's happening, like this is a cycle in history, right? Like this happens. Like bad people get into power and they plan and they play a long game. What's happening right now is a long game. And I think they got into power because people underestimated Christianity and they thought that they would be reasonable human beings that would be sensitive to logic and reason, and they're just not. You have to have a different conversation with the evangelical, the Christian nationalist.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like I'm in a way the victim of spiritual abuse, as you say, via Christianism. I mean, I was deconstructing on a similar line to what you were saying, not in the same way, but theologically and biblically, and some experiences in the church that finally soured me to a lot of it, and I walked away from it. But at the same time, this was right around 2015 when in the run up to that presidential election. And I started seeing this wide swaths of evangelical support, white evangelical support for Donald Trump. And of course, then you had the 81% evangelicals. And I've seen the arc change. The narrative has shifted for them because they're saying, well, we held our nose and voted for Trump because we couldn't stand Hillary because she's an abortionist and a liberal and all this. However, that was what they said back in 2016. Now it's, hey, we embrace the cruelty. We don't care about democracy. And I just posted a thing on Threads the other day, and I always kind of poke the bear a little bit. I say, hey, Trump evangelicals, are you still okay with everything he's doing? No qualms, no problem. Yep. And I got a lot of responses. Yep, absolutely fine. No issues.
Terrifying.
Yeah, I said, so this whole thing, like you just said, You're not concerned about people getting arrested without due cause and, no trial, and they're just getting, deported and this and that. You fine with that? Because what if they're going to come for you someday? Nope, we don't care. None of that matters. They're illegal, blah, 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 blah. So you're exactly right. To me, that is an element of spiritual abuse. A lot of people are saying, if that's evangelicalism, fuck that. I don't want to have
Exactly.
anything to do with that.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. That's what it's become in so many ways.
Yeah, very black and white and polarized. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to deconstruct. You can deconstruct politically, religiously, doctrinally, theologically, church-wise. I mean, there's a lot of different, because I found there's no one path that's like, oh, there's one way to deconstruct. There's so many different avenues and paths. We all come at it from different perspectives and angles. There's no right way, is there? There's not one right way to deconstruct, is there? Yeah. So what about this issue now? Let's move on into this issue of recovery on the back end. Are you getting into that in the book where you say, okay, you've been abused, you've spiritually abused, sexually, whatever the abuse might have been, you've deconstructed potentially. What happens after that? How do you then rebuild your life back end? What's that piece?
Yeah, and I think that's something that is often missing from the conversation as well. And a lot of that is just like, we're traumatized and we're just trying to survive, right? We're just trying to survive the day. But the reality that despite horrible things that have happened to you, that you can still live a full, thriving, fully human life despite all of these horrible things that have happened to you. And the book itself just holds space for the fact that what happened to you is real. Like, we're not pretending that it didn't happen. We are not pretending that it didn't cause tremendous damage. And you have the pen from this day forward, and you get to decide what your life looks like, and you get to live a full, thriving life. And that can be with Christianity, if that is your choice, or without it, or someplace in between. It's not required that you have an affiliation with any religious organization or group or belief system to live a full, thriving life. And so that's a big part of the book. Probably the last half of it is focused on that, and that's a really important part of the work that I do. Is just like, there is a story. The story is not over, and we can continue to build just beautiful, thriving lives on our own terms after these horrible things that have happened to us.
It helps them then to put yourself in a context, because I just did a podcast not long ago with two women. They wrote a book called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. And one of the things I learned in talking to them was they said the difference now is that a couple generations later, back in the 70s, Bill Gothard was doing his thing, Dr. James Dobson, some of these big, massive people that built literal empires on the back of Christian parenting and marriage counseling and all the rest of it, seminars and books and conferences, made millions of dollars on it too. They said back then it was theoretical, but now we've got case studies. We've got a couple of generations. We now know, we can see the effects of this. And what I thought was,
It never worked, and it caused a lot of pain.
That is the myth, that if you just raise your kids according to this way, they will turn out perfectly or obedient or, change the world and dominion theology or whatever it might be, whatever bill of goods you were sold. And I thought to myself, I'm just one of them case studies. I'm not necessarily unique. Yes, my story might be unique, your story, but you and I, we're part of those case studies now. So we can put ourselves in a context and we can say, yeah, there's millions of us, potentially generations now. And that does help, I think, doesn't it, to put yourself in a larger picture?
Sure.
Yeah. So this is the last question. And how can people find you? So your book is called 1,000 Tiny Paper Cuts, The Subtle Insidious Nature of Spiritual Abuse and Life on the Other Side. Where can people find the book, and how can they get a hold of you if they wanted to contact you on social media?
Absolutely. And the book should be available wherever books are sold. It's available now. And then my main social media presence is on Instagram at Katherine Spearing. And then the nonprofit that I founded is Tears of Eden. And you can find that the website, tearsofeden.org, and also on Instagram at Tears of Eden Official. And then my website is Katherine Spearing, and I have a pretty regular email list talking a lot about like living a thriving life after abuse. And so I would encourage people to sign up there.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Well, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for spending some time, Katherine, talking to me. I've learned a lot too. Every time I talk to someone like you, I think, okay, there's a little bit more to take on board, a little bit more.
That's my favorite. That was my favorite part when I used to podcast, was just meeting other people and like learning within the context of a conversation. That was always really fun for me.
Yeah, and a big thank you again to David Morris for hooking us up. Keep sending people my way, David. It's great of meeting people like you, Katherine. So thank you so much. Take care and have a great day.